Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Dr. Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Paul. Join us for a conversation all about non-monogamy and the future of modern relationships. Together we talk about the difficulty with defining infidelity, how women and AFAB folks grow tired of monogamy faster than men, and liberating our desires. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Dr. Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist providing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, author of the Psychedelic Jealousy Guide, and founder of The Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, wow, what an episode. 90 million and growing on Ashley Madison. Wow. You know, I'm all here for consent. I'm all here for conversations about non-monogamy and doing it with the consent of all parties available. And we live in a world that really doesn't fund a lot of research on sex and definitely is not funding enough research on infidelity. A space like Ashley Madison has the capital to be able to do this and the desire, right? And so it was so powerful to connect with Paul and actually hear about a lot of the ongoing research they have in this space, because we truly don't have enough of this. And learning how women grow tired of monogamy faster than men, right? Like, we've talked about that on the podcast. I've known this, right? We talk about this a lot, but hearing it from more experts in the field, I just hope it sinks in every time to release whatever societal expectations have been on us. And even hearing about how men on the site, most of them in the research reported looking for emotional connection, right? There's so much here to unlearn about gender roles and expectations and society, and I'm just really excited to be hosting conversations like this, to be able to have a platform where we can talk about this, because there's a lot of healing work to do and a lot of liberation, pulling our sexuality out of the shadows and into the light. And I can confidently promise you that I'll be here in the space doing this work every Wednesday with you, dear listener. All right. If you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and free resources at modernanarchypodcast.com. And I want to say the biggest thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible to all people. So thank you. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all my love, and let's tune in to today's episode. Dear listener, there's a space already waiting for you where you are invited to let go of every old script about sex and relationships and begin living a life rooted in your pleasure, empowerment, and deep alignment. I'm Dr. Nicole, and this is your invitation to the Pleasure Liberation Groups, a transformative, educational, and deeply immersive experience designed for visionary individuals like you. Together, we'll gather in community to explore desire, expand relational wisdom, and embody the lives we're here to lead. Each session is woven with practices, teachings, and the kind of connection that makes real transformation possible. And I'll be right there with you, guiding the process with an embodied curriculum that supports both personal and collective liberation. This is your invitation into the next chapter of your erotic evolution. Say yes to your pleasure and visit modernanarchypodcast.com/pleasure practice to apply. So the first question that I ask every guest is, how would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Well, hello everyone. My name is Paul Keable. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at Ashley Madison. What that really means is I'm a person who's vastly interested in modern relationships, the impact of non-monogamy, whether disclosed or undisclosed, and what that means for the future of marriage, relationships, and just culture in general.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about all of this today. It was fun to check in with my community. Have you heard of Ashley Madison? Have you? And I did get a range of results. Mm-hmm.
I think, depending on your age spectrum, people in their early 20s might have missed out on some of our events from our past, which I'm sure we'll delve into. But
Yeah.
people north of 40 are probably going to be very aware of us. There's something about our brand that's really interesting and unique from a cultural standpoint, particularly for Gen Xers and millennials. Did you know there's a full episode of The Simpsons
Mm.
dedicated to Ashley Madison?
Really? No, I did not.
Marge is interested in cheating on Homer, and she signs up to sassymadison.com.
Amazing. Wow. I did not. I'll have to go find that reference now. I mean, 80 million users is a lot of people around the world.
We've signed up hundreds of thousands of members a month. We're actually well over 90 million members now, having joined since we've launched. And it's the full range and gambit of ages, ethnicities, cultures, religions, economic level in a really interesting way. We're one of the few truly global dating apps because traditional dating can vary quite dramatically from culture to culture. I mean, I was in India in October. Arranged marriages are still very much a
Yeah.
normal part of the culture there,
Yes.
whereas infidelity is exactly the same around the globe. There really is only one or two places where a service like ours doesn't necessarily garner a lot of interest or attention. Places like France, because infidelity is already baked into the culture. The literal term pied à terre is the idea of having a place where I can meet with my, intimate partner outside of my marriage for the purposes of discretion. And it was well baked into that culture for generations on the male and female side. And so they don't need necessarily an app for that, whereas the
Mm.
rest of the world is very happy to have one like ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting because, as a psychotherapist, I think about research and the ways that if you're trying to survey people on this, people are often reluctant to want to disclose their desire to cheat on a partner, right? And so we don't have really good data on that because who wants to check the box? Yes, I do want to cheat, right? When people, no, I would never, right? So I think it's really interesting how your platform serves as, some sense of cultural data in that sense of how many people are signing up for this, as like you're saying too, in certain cultures around the world currently there's less of a draw for this because of their ideology there, right? That's data that we just don't even have because of the reluctance of research in the ways that people don't want to disclose.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually one of the favorite parts of my job. So I've been with the organization for more than 10 years now. And just as you said, it's infidelity is a very difficult subject matter to research because general pop research, general pop surveys are not going to provide a lot of useful data because people lie. They lie to
Yeah,
themselves about this
exactly.
subject matter. So, whereas if you've already signed up to
Yeah.
Ashley Madison, you're sort of already indicate, okay, I'm interested in space. So we have academics from universities all over the country and the world who have come to us to delve into the various aspects of infidelity because we are one of the more unique sources for that information. And we think it's very helpful at this, as well as being the world's largest married dating, app. we're also the world's largest marriage counseling service because if you don't
Oh,
want your spouse
interesting.
to cheat on you, listen to me and my colleagues as to why people join. What are they actually looking for versus what you think they're looking for so you can avoid those pitfalls within your relationship.
I mean, I'm curious already what you have to say there because, I think we all have multiple relationships, and I see it as more of a lens of like deconstructing internalized purity culture and the restrictions on our sexual liberation, right? So I see it maybe in a bit of a different lens than like prevention, but I'm curious what you have to say about it.
Well, yeah, and we love the different perspectives on things because, you know, at a starting point, if you look at, infidelity, it's an interesting concept because if I was to go sleep with somebody who's not my wife when I was married,
Hmm.
um, that ubiquitously would be considered cheating around the world. What happens if I go to dinner with a woman who's not my wife? Is that cheating? What happens if I go to a strip club without my wife? What happens if I masturbate or watch pornography?
Right.
So many people consider every single one of those acts a form of cheating, but we don't discuss those aspects. We don't sit down at the altar or prior to the altar and lay out here are my rules of what I consider cheating. And so many of us have a viewpoint in our heads and we don't sit down to it. And it creates a lot of problems getting into relationships as the years progress.
Absolutely. I mean, emotional cheating, right? The concept that you can't have a deeper emotional connection with another human, which becomes particularly challenging when you're queer and attracted to all genders because it's like, oh, I can't have any friends. Oh, damn, right? Like it becomes very clear and apparent once you kind of step into a queer space how unfeasible that is, right? But you're so right in terms of needing to define if you are practicing sexual fidelity to define where that is, and especially even culturally, right? Like a kiss on the cheek in some cultures is totally fine. Absolutely
Hmm.
forbidden could be cheating in America, or in some cultures, even just any touch and contact is absolutely forbidden, right? Like a hug or even a handshake is not okay between opposite genders, right? And so I think it's so important to reflect on your personal decisions there when you are constructing a relationship with fidelity of what is that for you. And like you're saying, so many people never get into the nitty gritty of that. And then years later find really difficult problems come up because of that lack of conversation.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that I find interesting, particularly, and this is, I think, primarily unique to America,
Mm.
is the Graham rule. I'm not sure if you're familiar with
No,
this.
no, yeah.
So, Billy Graham, the evangelical pastor.
Oh, sure.
So, you can
Yes.
imagine where this is going. And your former vice president followed this rule based on reports that I've seen that a married man cannot be alone in a room with a woman who's not his wife
Well,
even
right.
in a business setting. In a business setting, now one that's a widely misogynistic rule in my mind because it casts the female as the an evil that she
Hmm.
would tempt me, and I, as a man, have no control over my actions once that temptress is near me, and it's a ludicrous idea in my personal opinion, but it really is something that a lot of people do listen to, and we're again I'm in Canada, we're watching our southern neighbors move decidedly culturally to the right. And, for those who are participating in a more open style relationship or even a secretive relationship, there's some very scary, initiatives that are being pursued potentially. And we have to be very cognizant of what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you in on many of the listeners of the show know my history and background that I grew up in purity culture. And so I had a purity ring and I was one of those people that was never alone in a room with a man because that was too tempting, right? And the flesh would just
Exactly.
succumb to both of us and we would just crumble in sexual erotic play, right? Or whatever. The devil would come for me. So I am definitely one of those people. Like I was raised in that and fully believe that, I think, which is part of what has made my journey so fascinating to go from that space to the other and to still have family. My mom is Mormon, my sister, like I have such close connections to people who exist in that world, and I no longer do. And so I think that paradigm shift to walk through all those consciousnesses is quite a
Hmm.
journey. And so, yes, I guess what you're saying about that rule of the forbiddenness, absolutely.
Yeah, well, the more you tell people they can't do something unambiguously, and anybody who's a parent knows this. You tell
Right.
your kid they can't do something, That's the one and only thing
Uh-huh.
I'm going to do. I'm going to make it my life's mission to do that very, very thing. And it's interesting, we over-index significantly on a membership in Utah. And I don't think it's a coincidence
Yeah, say
that that is the
more.
Mormon base.
Say more. I mean, I see the connection right there, but for the listener who does not, you want to connect those dots?
Well, there obviously there's a history to the Church of Latter-day Saints and polygamy, but I
Yeah.
don't think it's actually connected to that. I think there is a potentially some of that. I think it's more of the very strict upbringing, as you said, that purity culture that exists within that movement or that religion and that culture more specifically, that makes it taboo, sex and sexuality. And we live in a world where it's omnipresent. Like there's never a time where you really can turn off the visuals and the audio as it relates to things of a sexual nature, even if that's not what you're looking for. Every TV show that
Yeah.
we love and is popular movie has infidelity in it. And so we're being told it's horrible, yet it's one of the most popular subject matters out there. So how can both of those things be true? Well, I need to go investigate this clearly. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people find out, particularly as they, get a little bit older into their relationships and they start to understand their bodies, they understand, different sexual dynamics, and they realize they're missing out on something. And it actually, I think, to a degree, goes to some of the research we did with the University of Missouri. A woman named Dr. Alicia Walker, who's a professor there, she wanted to really get into what are the motivations for infidelity based on gender? Like, why do women cheat? Why do men cheat? We have this idea culturally and from an entertainment perspective that it's always the powerful, lustful man who just wants to acquire as many beautiful young women in his bed as possible.
Hmm.
And for women, they're emotional and they're needy and they need, that loving affection aspect. So it's very much a mental state. And she wanted to, either prove or disprove these sort of concepts. And here's the interesting thing: 80% of the women in this research on Ashley Madison were cheating because they were in a sexless or orgasmless marriage.
Mm.
And what was fascinating, as she delved into these members and their stories, she would talk to some of them. They would tell her that they love their partner, they
Oh,
love their
yeah.
life, their family, and they had no desire to dissolve this. But nor were they willing to live in a world where their sexual satisfaction was set aside. And many of them would have the conversations with their partners, and they were either unable to or unwilling to fulfill her needs. And so they outsourced their intimate needs to Ashley Madison to maintain their primary relationship. And people get upset at this, and I can understand why. But here's the thing: you're asking this woman to either compromise on her sexual satisfaction at age, let's say, for sake of argument, 40. That's a really long sexual life to just give up on joy and happiness. And the alternative, culture tells us, well, if you're unsatisfied with your partner and you can't address it or fix it, then you have to divorce. Well, that's costly, that's expensive, and has a huge impact, particularly if you have children. And if I love the person and I can get what I need elsewhere, isn't that the better option? I mean, that is probably a really good argument for polyamory,
Right.
but until we can get to a stage where people embrace that in much larger numbers, I think Ashley Madison's going to have a role. But here's the thing that makes people very uncomfortable, I think.
Mm.
The majority of men in the study were seeking emotional validation.
Mm.
And here is something I've come to see the truth in this. Men were raised, particularly in Western culture, to be stoic, to
Yep.
suppress our emotions. We are told we are the providers, of the house. We are the man of the house, and we are not to allow these things to impact us. And so we live in a world where when we see a woman, we'll say, "Oh, Nicole, your hair looks fantastic. Oh, that dress looks really nice on you." Those types of aesthetic compliments are not necessarily part of the culture towards men. We rarely get those. Oh, that haircut looks very nice. Oh, that shirt looks nice. So I tell females who are in relationships, if you want your man to be, feel loved, it's not just the sex that he's wants, the physical interaction. He wants to hear words of affirmation from you. Tell him, hey, your butt looks nice in that in those jeans. You look really nice in that shirt. And it seems counterintuitive that men would desire this, but we're very similar in our wants and needs.
Hmm.
And so while that relationship, those affairs for men still will manifest in a physical way, but ultimately the underlying drive and motivation for them is to feel desired, to feel wanted. So it's the flip of what everybody thinks.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that makes so much sense to me. The ways that you're saying men are individualistic, right? They're completely fine on their own, right? Where women are much more relational, at least in our culture, like that is taught to them. And so they therefore enact that. And men, it's like you tell the little boy, man up, that scrapes his knee on the playground, right? So from a young age, we get taught this. I think inherently we're all relational, regardless of your gender, right? But this is the cultural stereotypes that we live in. And then therefore what ends up happening is a lot of men live in relationships where they're not seen, even in the quote unquote guy time, right? It's watching, if you think about it stereotypically, it's watching sports, playing this video game, all this sorts of stuff, which is quality time, but not a lot of intimacy of, hi, I see you, friend, and you're going through this. Wow, that sounds really difficult. And so they're lacking a lot of that emotional connection. And I remember being in my feminist class and we were talking about this, and I was like, well, maybe men are just fine. And they were like, well, actually, the suicide rates of men are drastically higher, right? And so, yes, I think that overall men in our culture are really lacking deep, fulfilling emotional relationships. And so that data makes so much sense to me. And I read Untrue by Wednesday Martin. Have you heard of that book? Right.
I know
Okay.
Wednesday. Yes.
Yeah, great. So I'll clue in the listeners. Really interesting book. She had mentioned this one research study with, I think it was a type of monkey. I'm not gonna macaque. I don't even know how to pronounce the monkey, but it was a type of monkey, close in relation to us, right? And there was a researcher where, yeah, they had put the monkeys in a cage, and it was a smaller cage, and the male monkeys were mounting the females, and the females were very passive, yada yada, right? They decided, what if we expanded the cage and gave much more space and researched the monkeys like that. And in that cage, the females were much more assertive and pursuing the sex on their own. But after a certain amount of time, the female monkeys got bored and stopped having sex. So the researchers thought, wow, what if we add in some new male monkeys? The second they added in new male monkeys, the females were having sex again, right? Okay, wow, what an interesting take for the female side, which has been taught for years that no, you just want one person to emotionally fulfill you and to be your secure anchor. I don't know. Look at this research that we're seeing, right? Diversity seems to be rather exciting for females. And of course, we're not monkeys. And I think what we're saying to that earlier is because monkeys don't stop doing things for a three-letter word called God, okay? We,
Hmm.
this culture will go, God, wow, I'm actually never going to have sex my whole life for that three-letter word, which respect to what that means to people. But of course, we can't translate the research from monkeys directly to humans because of all of the cultural variables around that. But that being said, I think there's a lot to say in that research of diversity, and I'll stand for that any day that I love my people. I love my people, but I need diversity in my sexual activity.
Yeah, no, I think, and what's fascinating is that I think Wednesday did talk about the fact that women tire of monogamy far quicker than men.
Yes,
If
yes.
you do research and you ask couples who have come to polyamory or open type relationships later in life, almost always, or the vast majority, is going to be a female-led exercise.
I
And
know.
again, people think it's the men who are like, oh, I just want to have as much sex as I possibly can. That's not what's happening. Women get very easily, not easy, sorry, I should rephrase that. Women tire of monogamy quicker than men do.
I
And the
know.
reality is, if you sit back and look at it, marriage is in the modern world asking one person to be my lover, my financial partner, my co-parent, my best friend, my social partner, my chores partner. That is an enormous burden for one person to hold on to for 40, 50, 60 years. And interestingly, particularly when you look at parts of America where the marital age is much younger,
Mm,
and generally speaking, the sex education is abysmal at best, those are the people who are more likely than not who are going to explore infidelity at some point in their relationships because of curiosity, because of boredom, and because they come to realize there's so much more out there and getting married at 24, 25, and missing out on their exploratory years and finding out what really makes them tick. Like one of the most fascinating things I read a few years ago, what related to female sexuality and sex, is do you know who Rachel Bilson is?
no.
Actress.
Mm-mm.
I think you would know her if you saw her. She's been in a bunch of
Okay.
stuff. So she at one point would have been considered a tier A actress.
Hmm.
And in typical Hollywood, she's gorgeous, she's beautiful, she's smart, and she's articulate. And she was on a podcast talking about how she never had an orgasm until she was 30 years old. So
Heartbreaking.
here is a beautiful woman who, has the pick of the litter comparatively for, alpha type males, as it were. And she had no awareness that she wasn't really having good sex until suddenly at 30 she did. And that goes to the lack of sexual education as it relates to what is good sex. Number one, just generally, what is good sex for a woman specifically? We don't teach our kids these things. People get freaked out when I say this because I am a parent. I have two young teenage boys who, roll their eyes constantly at me when I'm talking about these things. But the reality is, don't you want your kids to grow up to be good lovers and to have good sex, right? If you want to avoid a lot of the things we're going to talk about on this episode in terms of infidelity, cheating, and all those other things, that's a big driver, particularly in the female side. And if she doesn't know her body, if she doesn't understand what good sex is, how is she possibly going to have that? And I
Hmm.
have friends who have daughters, and I'll bring this subject matter up to them. And I hear the typical refrain, "Oh, I hold a shotgun handy just in case that boyfriend shows up at the door." And I get the joke, and ha ha, it's funny, but it really isn't.
Right.
Because I'm like, don't you want your daughter to be able to do the same things you and your wife do? And they look at me horrified. I'm like, then why are you doing that to your wife? And then like the light bulb goes on, and they're like, "Shut up, Paul. We don't want to talk to you anymore."
Yeah.
Because it's a realization of, well, wait a minute, what am I burdening my children with the shame that I carried around sex and intimacy? We shouldn't do that. But
Hmm.
society, particularly again in America, is really, really not ready for that.
Yes.
And we would much rather control it with purity rings and signed documents promising, virginity to marriage and all sorts of silly rigmarole that does not work in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. People get hurt. People exist in relationships where their pleasure isn't centered, right? At the full extreme, people are really hurt. I do think that all of that is what contributes to rape culture generally in our society. And I remember even just watching one of the Netflix documentaries around sex that had talked about rape fantasies being particularly more common within American culture than other cultures. And we have to look at that and say, why is that a fantasy here that is not consistent around the world in the same rates, right? I understand, the fantasy of that. I understand consensual, non-consent play. But when we look at a fantasy like rape, right, and it being more common in America than other countries around the world, we have to
Interesting.
talk about that. Yeah, it was in one of the Netflix documentaries about sex. I'll have to find it and include it in the show notes. But it was jarring for me to see that because I think as a researcher, you have to like unpack where that's coming from. And I think it's coming back to all the stuff that you're saying right now, this fear around talking about this, the taboo, the taboo, the taboo, as well as all of the problems we talked about relationally of not getting our needs met and being seen in that. So we add, I'm working right now in community mental health. I'm working with like court mandated folks right now with anger. And you see the lack of skills really in our country, let alone sex, but just like emotional health in general. And so all of that comes together. And so the more that we can have these conversations and bring it into the light, and when you're educating your children, you are changing that future. I've read research that talked about masturbation starting between the ages of 2 to 6 years old. A lot of people are not ready to have that kind of conversation with their kids, but they damn well should be because that is a normal age to start exploring your body and being curious about the pleasure that is possible. And so people really got to loosen up to this because it is a part of how we're going to get to this other future where we can have open communications and people are not getting hurt and we can have more pleasure, more orgasm, more connection, more love, and all these things.
Absolutely. But I will tell you on a positive note, there's a
Yeah,
lot of research out there that shows that, or says at least, that the current Gen Z population or generation is having far less sex than its previous cohorts. I
sure.
don't believe this. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you why I don't believe it. The internet has changed things so dramatically. I'm Gen X, so I'm old.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up, the idea of having sex in high school was like the be all and end all, the pressure to do it. But it also was the same, dichotomy where the females were sluts if they did and, prudes if they didn't. So there was a
Mm-hmm.
no win situation and everybody was talking about it. But I don't really believe very many of us were actually doing it.
Mm.
And there was no way to prove these things. But now that everything's online, people are talking about things more openly, and sex and sexuality are subject matters that kids are becoming more aware of earlier, but also more comfortable talking about. They have eschewed some of the shame and guilt associated with the subject matter, saying, I don't have the same judgments. And a good example was this. I remember my son came home in grade six, so he was about 12 years old. And he said to me, Dad, so and so came out as bi today to me, one of his male friends. And I said, Oh, interesting. And how did that go? He goes, Oh, it just went, Dad. What do you mean?
Yeah,
Like he's bi.
exactly.
And it was such an amazing moment as a dad for me because my kids were like, yeah, he's bi. He's sharing information with me, so he's comfortable. Yay. But there was no judgment. There was no follow on to, there was nothing bad that happened about this. I can't even imagine, you know, somebody in my high school, never mind grade six, coming out as gay, never mind bi, and
Right.
the abuse that poor person would have taken,
Yep.
even just being assumed gay in high school. We all knew who those people were because they were still figuring out their identity and their sexuality, but the judgment was harsh. And
Hmm.
these kids are saying, you know what? I'm not going to carry the guilt and shame you have. I am interested in sex. I'm interested in a variety of different sexual things, but I'm not feeling the pressure to do as much as you might have felt. So they're going to
Hmm.
do a lot more different things in a variety of ways that make parents today uncomfortable. It shouldn't, as long as you're having good conversation. But they're not going to have the same pressure to, succumb to someone else's desires because they understand consent, they understand desire, they understand the options available to them because there's so much more information. So the ones who are researching, they're going out there. So I don't think they're necessarily having less. I think they're having better sex. I
Right.
think they're having more varied sex. And I think it's a good thing. And parents shouldn't be afraid of it. Yes, let's talk about consent. But yes, let's talk about safe sex, but let's also talk about what's good sex and in how to balance those things off. And I think it leads to a brighter future.
Absolutely. Yeah. The more conversations. Absolutely. And how do we define sex, right? That's always my question. I think Dr. Julianne Husser had mentioned this research when we recorded, and I was talking to her about like, what is sex? Is masturbation considered sex? You know what I mean? Because, yeah, in our modern day and age, I got a magic wand, some great content. Like, is that falling into that research data? Is it just partnered? And where does queer sex fall in? Like, how do they define, sex in that sense? Because I would imagine, based on everything you're saying too, that our current culture has a wider variety of what sex can be to us than the traditional penis and vagina situation, right? So I think there's much more fluidity. And when I did my dissertation, there was very little research on the younger generations. There's only like a YouGov study, like not like a I know this is what we got right now, but it was saying that the like 40% of the younger generations are interested in non-monogamous relationships to some degree, which is drastic from the generations prior. And so there is this really big cultural shift that is happening. And I think we just lack the language and the emotional skills on how to do it in our culture, particularly.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, so my father's generation, the baby boomers,
Yeah.
they lived in a world where premarital sex was very much taboo. It was
Yep.
frowned upon. Now,
Yep.
I'm convinced they were all still doing it,
Sure.
but nonetheless, culturally speaking, it was very taboo. Gen X, not just acceptable, it was almost, at least for millennials now, it was a prerequisite. Who wants to you know, uh, train a rookie as part of their marriage? We want to go out there and have those experiences, and it's acceptable. And the shift from understanding that premarital sex is okay to polyamory is okay is not that big of a leap. So it
Hmm.
doesn't surprise me that this younger generation is saying, "Oh yeah, I'm interested in different types of relation dynamics." So again, my generation, that Sex in the City was a huge sort of
Right.
moment where these independent, you know,
Yep.
uh, you know, women were leading very different sex lives and very openly. From the extreme of Carrie to the more prudish. I can't remember what
Samantha.
her character is.
Samantha's the
No,
extreme.
sorry,
Samantha's
sorry,
the extreme.
Samantha.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
sorry, you're right.
I love
Samantha was the
Samantha.
extreme. Samantha was the extreme, and the brunette. I cannot
Charlotte,
remember her name.
Charlotte, Charlotte. I love that
Thank you
show.
very.
I feel like I'm
There you
embodying it
go.
with the podcast.
There you go. And Charlotte was the other, but they were all still having premarital sex in different
Yes.
ways. To go from, hey, it's totally cool that you and I are dating, we're having sex with other people, but tomorrow we're going to commit to fidelity of sex for the next 40 years. That's like a huge sort of promise. And it's kind of absurd to a degree if you think about it. And so I think Gen Z is looking at this saying, okay, the leap from premarital sex is okay to polyamory being okay is not that big of a jump. And I think we're going to see increasingly monogamy go under different changes as this generation decides how they want their relationships to look and feel. And Dr. Tammy Nelson, who is a sex therapist and a marriage therapist that we work with, she has a really cool concept called a monogamy contract. And she advocates that if you're in a committed relationship, married or long term, that you renew your monogamy contract every 5 years. What does our monogamy mean to us for the next 5 years? Because monogamy at 25 is dramatically different at 40 and at 50 and at 60 because my
Okay.
needs, desires, wants change. And this isn't just specifically boiling down to purely sex or intimacy. There's a range of subject matters that you could, decide that you want to put into your monogamy contract. And the more you talk about these things, the more you open yourself up to experiences, the more you open yourself up to opportunities, the better and the deeper your relationship can go. Is it uncomfortable? Deeply. Is it the potential for your partner to say, you know what, Paul, I really, appreciate that you're open with me, but I'm not going to do that thing you want to do. I'm not going to participate in that. But if we can get to a point where you're comfortable being told no without the shame and guilt, that's for the better. Because otherwise, you're going to desire, the more you think about it without divulging that desire, that thought, that interest, it's going to build, it's going to increase. And then
Mm-hmm.
you're going to do it in a way that's going to compromise your own ethics potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might ruin a potentially amazing relationship where maybe your partner was into that and you had no idea because you're so afraid. And that's the interesting thing. A lot of feedback I get from people, the negative feedback around, how dare you run an infidelity based dating app is, how can you possibly help these people cheat? And it's like, well, otherwise, without us, they're still going to do it, but they're going to do it in horrible ways. They're probably going to do it in the office. They're going to do it with potentially someone in their social circles and increase their chance of getting caught. And so we're trying to give people the outlet to really maintain their primary relationship. And the outcomes from affairs are not exactly what people expect them to be necessarily.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think in an ideal world, we are all talking about it openly and we're all communicating and all of that. In our current cultural context, it's very difficult for a lot of people right now. And so I see the position that you're sitting in right now is giving that outlet to people. Ideally, in a world, we are all communicating about it, but that's just not the world that we live in right now, particularly for older generations. And so you are standing in that space. I guess for me, I'm curious, about the things that get in the way of having that conversation. Hey, I want to open our marriage, right? I think about the cultural narratives of what it means, right? In my past consciousness, where I was going to marry one person, have sex with one person for the rest of my life, that would feel like the most jarring comment that I would have ever heard from my partner because it meant that I was not enough, that our love was a failure, that I'm a failure. Oh my God. And so I would love to pick apart some of the messiness of the web that gets in the way of people actually naming this desire because I have multiple lovers. Shit, we travel together, you know what I mean? Like it's like one step above kitchen table in my opinion, you know what I mean? And so it's like how do we get that level of communication and openness and support and liberation if that's what people want, right? And clearly there are 80 million people who want this world, right? How do we get that? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's to me it goes back to, sex education, intimacy education,
Right.
relationship education to children. Because the more open we are as a society in terms of what sex is, it isn't. So for example, I've talked to my kids because I have boys
Mm,
and I remember this is years ago. I said to them, I know you have seen pornography. I'm not going to ask you what you've seen. I'm not going to ask how you got there because it's ubiquitous. I think the average age is around 12 or 11 for boys to see
sure.
pornography. And quite surprisingly, I think that's a little old. I think it's probably a lot earlier. And
Mm-hmm.
I would sit down and say, listen, you're going to see some stuff. Some of it might be very, very jarring. And I said, try to imagine this. You watch all your favorite Marvel movies. And a lot of
Right.
these stunts they do are real people doing real stunts. You're seeing them physically do that. But you recognize that that's not real life. That's not what you're not going to go off and jump off that building because you know bad things are going to happen to you. So the scenes you're watching in a pornographic movie, yes, there are two real people doing that scene, but here's the reality. It's not particularly comfortable. Probably not wildly enjoyable for either one, quite frankly, but almost certainly not for the woman. And that isn't likely how your first, sexual escapades are going to go. So don't try some of these advanced level, things you see, or don't even think that they're what's appropriate for you. It doesn't mean it's bad. There's actually a great woman. If you've never, interviewed her, you should probably track her down. Her name's
Mm.
Cindy Gallup.
Oh yeah, I
And
have a Make Love Not Porn. We've talked. Hell yeah.
yeah, so I love Cindy. I've talked to her many times in the past. And, for your listeners who hadn't heard that episode, Cindy Gallup is a woman who prefers, relationships with much younger men.
Yep.
And she's very open about this. And she actually had used one of our sites, Cougar Life, previously. And as she started dating these younger guys, some of them were trying to introduce, pornographic moves to her in the bedroom. And she's like, hold on, guys. I know you've seen that and you think that's normal. That's not the way it works. And it spurred an idea in her head that, sex education needs to change. So she launched a business called Make Love Not Porn,
Hmm.
where quote unquote regular people film their lovemaking and then upload it for others to view and rent. And the point of it is to show what regular sex actually looks. And her tagline to the site is brilliant. It's pro porn, pro sex, pro knowing the difference. And I think
Mm,
to your question again is, how do we get people comfortable with this? Well, the more you talk about it earlier, and again, age appropriate stuff,
right.
the more comfortable people are and the less shame and guilt. Because I think the shame and the guilt and the fear related to sexual interest and desire is what is the main blocker to having any conversation, not just can we open a relationship? Because I think opening our relationship is a very advanced level type conversation. But think about this. Hey, what about putting on lingerie? Hey, what about, this sex position or that sex position? What about watching pornography together? People are terrified to approach their partner, not because necessarily they're afraid of being judged. Well, I think it's a big part of it. They're afraid of told no. They're
Mm,
afraid of their partners thinking, that's crazy. Why would only weird people would want to do that? And
mm,
that is a huge block that people need to get over. And listen, outside of some pretty extreme, illegal and what we all culturally globally will say is bad stuff. I don't think we need to get into that.
sure.
You should be open to your partner's sexual desire, not necessarily do it just because they want to do it, but open, discuss it. And then if it's not something you're willing to or interested in doing, let's then talk about what's behind that desire. Because maybe there's an alternative that will fit the bill, as it were. But we're in a society where it's lights out, pull my nightie when you're down, when you're done approach for a lot of people in Western civilization. And that is such a horrific way to have a sex life,
I know it's heartbreaking. It's
isn't it?
why I do everything I do, right? Like, ah, my heart. Just to think, even to turn the lights on when you're having sex with your partner feels like a lot for people. Like,
I mean, there's people out there who are like at 40 and they're talking about separate bedrooms. And I'm like, oh, that's just a relationship killer. That's just, oh, how do
hey.
you not want to be in touch with your partner and have that closeness? Maybe that's just a personal opinion.
Sure, sure. I guess it depends on what that means. Because when I think separate bedrooms, I think, wow, yes, I'm with my polyamorous lover and we have two separate bedrooms that are private. So I can take someone to my bed. We have a bed maybe we share. So maybe there's three bedrooms in here, like a joint one, my own, like, so when I think
Okay, well,
separate, I think,
you're okay. I'm thinking about people who are in traditionally monogamous relationships having separate bedrooms. You're a little bit more advanced, so I applaud you and your willingness to sort of tell people about it. Because here's the thing: the
yeah,
more you normalize it, what people don't realize is that people who are in polyamorous relationships and open relationships. They're very normal people. They're
yeah,
not these, sex addicts who are doing all this weird kinky shit all the time. Some of the time we are, but not all the time. It's
right.
just we're just open to the opportunities and we know what our body's like and we know how to connect with people and it having an experience with one person doesn't denigrate the experience I've had with the previous person.
Right.
And that part is really tough for people to get over. Like, how can
Hmm.
I do that with her and then do it with someone else tonight and not have an impact? Well, it's called conversation. It's called discussion. It's called setting up boundaries. And polyamory doesn't erode jealousy, it doesn't get rid of it. You still have jealousy within that dynamic, but the difference is that you've been trained to talk about it,
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
nullify it by being open about the outcomes and the interests and the desires and all the things you're doing within that dynamic. And that's the fundamental part that people I think fail to understand.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is the jealousy will shift. There's often, yeah, this assumption that polyamorous open folks are so obsessed with sex, but like you're saying, sometimes I think it's almost the opposite because you can get to a space where you're like, you know what? Like, I don't care what you do with your time, whether you're fucking someone else or you're playing a board game, that's time away from me, right? And so I process that the same. And so if you're doing this board game group that meets every week and suddenly you have no time for me, I'm actually more jealous about that than that one
Hmm.
comment partner that you have sex with once a month. Like suddenly that does not become as jarring as this other D&D group that you're, or whatever it is.
Oh
So
no.
it's
Well, do you
funny.
remember the movie This Is 40?
Yes.
And Paul Rudd is he sneaks off, and his wife's convinced he's cheating, and she tracks him and follows it out. And he was doing fantasy baseball,
Right, exactly.
but she had a complete meltdown about it because he was being secretive about it. And it
Hmm.
follows exactly on your point. It's if we go away from our partners and we don't talk about what led us to do those things, it doesn't matter if you're a golf widow, a fantasy baseball widow, or somebody sleeping with somebody else. If you're not talking about it, that's what's going to lead to those hurt feelings, those feelings of abandonment. And I
Hmm.
think that's one of the key sort of drivers around these things is that people feel uncomfortable expressing their emotions, particularly on the male side.
Right.
And the more we can do to ease our partner's anxiety and concerns around those spaces, give them the space to express those feelings, the opportunities for your relationship to expand, not necessarily into polyamory, but expand in terms of how you connect with one another is really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I'm always talking about on the podcast to normalize it, get more airtime, bring it into the light is, when we put monogamous people, I mean, currently where we're at with our research is we don't even define the variable of monogamy or non-monogamy in a lot of our sexual research, which is a reflection of the paradigm that we live in as we just assume these people are monogamous. But when we put people in research studies where they map their genital response and watch porn, right? People have reactions to other people. So it's like no matter what you practice, you are going to be attracted to other people, right? Like, so there is that baseline attraction that we all have to other people. Okay. It's a question of what do you want to do with your time and energy? And then what I come in as a relationship anarchist is that we all have multiple relationships. We all already have them. Most of us don't fuck more than one person in our current society, right? But like we all have multiple relationships because people are often like, how do you have time for all this? How do you have time for all this? I'm like, well, you have multiple relationships. Look at all of your friends. It's like, what if you started fucking your friends, right? Like, but it's trying to get that paradigm. People are like, that's so messy. And like, you're right, actually, in our current cultural setting of the lack of language, the lack of experience, lack of light, it is pretty messy. But we all can move through that as a society and change, right? And so it's like you already have the time. It's just envisioning a different world where sexuality is much more involved in those connections if you want it to be, right? The possibility is there for folks. But it's really hard to see that when you don't have a community. I think that's been one of the biggest things for me, like even that reference you made to the bedroom, right? Oh, separate bedrooms. I have a handful of people in my community that have separate bedrooms in poly. And so, like, that's where my consciousness goes because I have all these friends around me who do this, but I also have the privilege of living in Chicago. The amount of clients that reach out to me saying, "I'm in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. I'm in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. Where do I find these people?" That's where I do refer to websites, right? Because it's like, "Hey, get on that dating app, get on this because it is hard in your area to find that and it's hard in the city too, but it's particularly a question of the location. Rural settings make this much trickier for folks to ever tap into a community, which is what is needed to transform into a new paradigm.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that also is we live in a society that dances around, infidelity through language in ways that people aren't really, I don't think they think about it. The idea of having a work wife or a work husband is
Sure.
normal. But
It's so
what's
funny.
the underlying motivation for that? We laugh about it and you smile, but that's exactly what we're telling on ourselves that we do have the capacity to be interested in somebody else. That individual, my work wife, she's fulfilling the need that my wife is not fulfilling. But that we don't consider that infidelity, right? And I find that fascinating to me that these terminologies exist to excuse a form of infidelity and normalize it. But meanwhile, we'll tut anybody who actually performs what we call infidelity. And the contradiction is telling on ourselves because we do have the capacity. Listen, it goes also to the term hall pass.
Yeah.
Again, my generation, we grew up with friends. Ross had, when he was dating Rachel, he had, I think it was three or four people he could put on his list. And I'm not sure if you ever saw the episode, but he scratched off one woman and put on a different celebrity. And then in walks to the cafe Isabella Rossellini, who was actually on his list, and he explains it all to her. And it's funny as
Sure.
hell because she's like, too bad. That maybe I would have been interested. But we,
Mm-hmm.
we, we, we dance around this idea that, well, it's totally fine. My husband has, a celebrity wish list. Well, why does he have a wish list? What is he looking for? What is missing? So the idea that we desire something beyond our particular primary partner doesn't mean that we don't love and care for that
Yeah.
partner. And doesn't mean they're not enough. It's just that there's so much else out there, and others can provide things that our primary partner can't. And that's not necessarily negative, but we live in a world that we're still not comfortable coming to terms with those those words, those phrases, those parts of our culture that we laugh about and we make jokes, but that underscore the weaknesses of monogamy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for my past consciousness and all the listeners that then say, how am I special if they're fucking other people? It's like, oh, I wish I could just give them the consciousness download that it's like, you are the only you. You are the only you. There is no other you. Okay. So there is no comparison in that sense, right? Like there is only you. And if someone wants to be with you, they're going to be with you. And so, how am I special? It's literally your consciousness. When I'm playing with you, it is you and all of your history and your energy and your erotic power and all of that. Like that is the specialness right there. And then this fear of like, is it going to change the whole world and the dynamic? Maybe. Yeah, that is fucking scary. And you're right. But Lord knows, I want to live in a free world rather than trying to cage my partner. And do you know how good it feels to know that my partner could fly all around the world and actively chooses? My lovers choose me, right? Like, I wish I could give people that consciousness download that they could see, like, I am special. No one is going to ever replace me as a human being. If that person wants to leave, let them. Let them.
Mm-hmm.
Would you want them otherwise if you had to hold them with a leash? Fascinating, right? But I think what's interesting is like in my own journey with jealousy and this, holy shit, is it easy to for myself to have uh, we don't need to name numbers, multiple lovers, right? I have so many different lovers at this point, it's a blur, and I love that. But like the second one of my lovers, depending on how close an attachment they are, and then depending on how much I vision out for them, like, is this the person I might want to have kids with when, whatever, all of that, then I get much more spiky about who they have relationships with. And so I think it's so much easier when we're in our own consciousness because we have control over it. These are all my lovers, right? I have control. The second you're talking about an external variable, which is your lover and what they do, it brings up all of your fears and desires for control and attachment and narratives, and it is difficult. So, hence, like, it's easy to practice infidelity because you really are only existing in that lane. But when you try to give that same level of freedom and communication to another person, it is jarring to work through your attachment style. Like, wow.
Especially if you were raised with the traditional conservative culture sense of one partner for life, and how
Yeah, that's me.
articulate that thought. And like I said, we said earlier, polyamory doesn't get rid of jealousy.
No.
But if you're doing it well, it opens up the communication channels to deal with it appropriately. But just as you said, the idea that I have to force my partner to be with me to ensure fidelity, th- that actually sounds the opposite of what you think it means. Because then are they with me because they want to be, or are they with me because they're scared if they do anything, they'll lose me? And that's a very different thing. Whereas, exactly as you said, if that person comes home to me every weekend, comes home to me every night after whatever else they've done, they've chosen to be me. And here's the thing: if you're a parent of more than one kid, you know this to be true. You have the capacity to love more than one person equally. Though I will often tell one boy I love him more than the other, just to do things. No, I don't. I don't do that. No, but the reality is, if you have more than one children, as I do, you love them equally, differently though. But
Mm,
you do love them differently,
yeah.
and the capacity to have multiple lovers and care for them individually, uniquely, and have some sort of prioritization within that is completely normal. The reality is monogamy is not a natural phenomenon. The
Thank
animal
you.
world is there's very, very few animals that are truly monogamous.
Yep.
There's a lot of myths and misconceptions around that. But the reality is it's really low in terms of true fidelity in the animal world. And at the end of the day, we're slightly more evolved animals. So why think that we're any more special than everything
Mm-hmm.
else on this planet?
Mm-hmm.
And sexual
Mm-hmm.
diversity is one of the reasons the planet has evolved in the manner it has and given us the diversity of life that exists here. So that might be a bit too big of a leap for, some traditional conservative people, but it's the truth.
Yeah, well, and the reality is, even if you don't believe in evolution, right, and they believe in more creationism, look at history. If you look at the history of the human existence, it has not been monogamous, right? When we look back in our culture, that is not what has been happening. That's where this stuff from Wednesday Martin was really helpful to learn more about the agricultural revolution and when we started private property and then therefore the need to pass down control and etc. Like the more you learn about that, the more you realize, wow, even if you don't believe in our animal beginnings, right, that like, oh shit, historically, this isn't even what we practiced, right? And so I think the more people download that, it is a consciousness download to kind of shift and start like realizing that we've been lied to, sold all of these myths, and that actually we all are attracted to multiple people, right? And I guess, Paul, if I'm just being honest at this point, I feel like I've lost touch with reality in the most beautiful way because it's just like, damn, you're missing out on so many experiences. If I, maybe I won't speak to other people. Live your life, you guys. But for myself, if I could speak to my previous consciousness, it's like, damn, Nicole, one day you will be in a room with people that you all love and trust and feel so deeply safe with that when they put their hands on your body, just the touch of your body feels orgasmic. And you have multiple people touching you and bringing you to pleasure. And the capacity for pleasure in your body when you're being touched with all of that stimulation with people that you trust and you love and you feel safe with, oh my gosh, is it radical? Like I feel like I've lost touch with reality in that sense because like I can't even fathom the past. Like there's just so much that people are missing out on in that sense.
You sound very grounded. And what's interesting in
Yes.
what there was something you said that really stood out. No, you do sound very grounded
Okay.
and not out of reality. Is often I hear my members say, they'll do interviews with the media. Uh, and the reason is catharsis because they can't tell their best friends what they're doing. So they can
Oh,
do these anonymous interviews.
yeah.
And sometimes like people ask me like, why would they risk that? Why would they do that? And a lot of the times the members will tell me this, just as you said, I'm speaking to my younger self.
Mm,
I'm giving my younger self permission to think differently because I wish I had this capacity and knowledge that there's so much more out there in the world to experience and not limit yourself because what we expect of the world and of relationships and monogamy is rarely the truth. Doesn't mean it's bad. Don't get me wrong. I am not in the business of denigrating monogamy in and of itself. I'm just saying it should not necessarily be the default and it should not be looked at as the only option and that everything
mhm,
else is an adverse event. And we're not their society. So listen, part of my job is going out and explaining these things and talking about these things. And in a weird way, if I was really, really good at my job, I would end Ashley Madison because I would convince people they don't need to cheat because they can have these open relationships and talk about different dynamics. But we're not going to be in that space for generations to come, quite frankly. So
mm,
the
yeah.
need for my business is going to be there. That said, it is evolving. And the idea that we could talk to our younger selves and convince them that how we view these things is different is interesting, but a lot of people do that.
Well, yeah, because a lot of people get mad at me. I'll just put that, which is like, cool, be mad, love that, rawr. But like a lot of people get mad at me when I make comments like that because they're like, well, I'm doing my thing, and the reality is my past consciousness would have also, when I've talked about this story on the podcast. I went to a Christian college. They asked for debate topics. I chose homosexuality, and I was like, homosexuals are sinners. They're going to hell, right? It's like curious as a queer woman now, like where was all that passion coming from? So my past consciousness would have slapped me if I said any of this, right? But I try to almost like soften the blow of what I say about these things because when I say them publicly, people take such a defense to it and get really activated. Where if I'm talking to my past consciousness, it's a little bit less direct of a message, right? Because it's jarring for people to hear, hey, monogamy is not what we practiced for all of these years. Hey, you could have sex with multiple people. Hey, all this, like, this is a very startling topic I'm sure you've seen that gets people really activated and just, confrontational, to put it lightly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that as sex becomes, more discussed and shown in
Yeah.
pop culture, more and more women are finding avenues to explore. And it's kind of a dividing rod in certain communities. But Fifty Shades of Grey was a
Mm.
moment for a lot of very conservative, traditional women. It was an eye-opening moment for them to say, "Holy shit!" Now, let's be very clear for those of you who know the BDSM space. That is a horrible book, and everything
Yeah.
about it has no correlation to what the BDSM world is about
Right.
whatsoever. So I
Right.
am not
Yeah.
suggesting it is, but take a minute and have a bit of a feel for your vanilla friends who had no idea about what the hell that world is about at all. And it opened up a moment where they said, "Ooh, maybe I do want to be spanked. Ooh,
Right. Right.
maybe I do want to be tied up. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But why am I suddenly getting these urges, these feelings? Why am I flushed watching this? Because this is different. Because it wasn't meant to be degrading. The idea was she was in her power. She was controlling the dynamic, not Gray. And so there is some truth to the BDSM community in that respect from the sub relationship. And we saw a jump in membership around that time. And I
Mm.
don't think it was coincidental because a lot of women were like, I
No.
want to do some stuff. And their husband's like, well, I don't want to do any of that stuff. And so they're like, well, I'm going to go get it somewhere. And people are exploring these. And sometimes it's just like a conversation, it's a chat. Some people will come on to Ashley and they'll use it to explore fantasies and talk to another partner who's in a similar situation because that capacity for empathy is very embracing and comforting. That I'm not a freak because I want to explore this. I'm not a bad person because we're particularly women, and though men too are told you're disgusting, you're a pervert, you're all these weird things. We're just having interest in a really kind of normalized activity, quite frankly.
Right.
And
Right.
and you talk to people who move into these spaces later in life, it's so liberating for them. And they're not, suddenly, shooting drugs and dropping out of society. They're elevated. They're more conscious about their actions and they're more comfortable. And here's another thing. We actually did another study with a professor out of University of Minnesota Duluth, Dr. Ashley Thompson, and she was studying the outcomes of affairs.
Mm.
30% of the people who were having affairs felt that their primary relationship improved because of
Yeah.
their affair.
I, I mean, yeah, I could
You're going to
understand.
say yes, but a lot of traditional people, like, how's that possible? Here's the truth. If you get to a certain age, you're going to know people who have had infidelity impact their marriage. More often than not, it doesn't end the marriage. It forces hard conversations.
Sure.
And then you mitigate what was the cause of that affair, because what's the point staying together if you're not going to make changes,
Right.
right? It's not
Yeah.
like I'm not just not going to cheat. One of us has to change. Dr. Tammy Nelson, calls these canoper affairs. Some people intentionally get caught having an affair to prove a point to their partner. Listen, I told you I wanted to do these things. You didn't listen to me, so I went this route because I needed to get your attention.
Mm.
And then the real conversations start. And the marriage can get a lot better after that. And people get mad when I say that. How could you possibly improve a marriage through an affair? I'm not saying it's necessarily the best path,
Right.
but sometimes it's the only path because one of the partners isn't listening, whether it's the wife or the husband. And because people have your interest in sex and intimacy changes over the years fundamentally. And one of the biggest, I think, cohorts is women postmenopausal. We were
Sure.
taught culturally for years.
Yeah.
Once that happens, sex life ends. And women, I think, fell into this. A lot of women fell into, I've had my menopause, I'm done. But now we're seeing women sexually liberated. I don't have to take the pill because that can cause problems health wise. And I'm no longer worried about pregnancy, which is a big issue and
Sure.
going to be worse in America these days. Um,
Yep.
and now I don't have to worry about that. So it's a new sexual liberation for a lot of postmenopausal women, and they're suddenly I have a renewed vigor and interest.
Mm-hmm.
And some of their
Mm-hmm.
husbands are like, "Well, what the hell?" There's this great member story I have. If you
Mm.
allow me to
Sure.
digress
Yeah, go
here,
for it.
I can talk about her name because she's gone public with her stories. This woman, Bobby Goldman, she was married to a big Hollywood producer. She lived, fabulous, like traveled, affluence, everything was there. She was also ran her own independent businesses, so she, wasn't just, a stay-at-home wife. And her husband sadly passed away, and she was in her, I think, her 60s at the time. And for a period of time, things got dark, and she was seeing a therapist, and the therapist said, "Listen, you're depressed. You need sex." She's
Mm.
like, shit, you're right. And so she signed up on all the traditional dating apps. And the problem for her was most of the guys in and around her age that she was interested in were looking for a caregiver,
Mm.
not a sexual partner. And she's like,
Sure.
no, no, that ain't working for me. So
Right.
she signed up to Ashley Madison and she met all these guys. And at one point, I think she had 7 different lovers. And some of the lovers, introduced her to their partners, their wives. And the wives
Mm.
would be like, oh, thank God you're doing this. I
Yeah.
was done with this phase. And it led to what was fascinating for me. And the reason I know this story and I can tell you this story because most of our members are obviously very discreet, she ended up writing an off Broadway musical called
Mm.
The Curvy Widow about her
Beautiful.
adventures. And it's a
Beautiful.
beautiful story because she found joy and happiness through this act of being an adulterer at the end of the day, even though she was a widower. But it shows you the capacity that people have for intimacy at very different stages. It doesn't end. For most people, it doesn't end almost ever. One of my favorite things I tell people is about my great grandmother. And I
Mm.
remember we she had to go into a nursing home in her late 90s. And my dad used to get a phone call every once in a while from the home saying, Mr. Keable, we need you to come pick up the grandmother. And my dad, like, well, what's the problem? Is she falling? She's sick? They're like, oh, no, no. She's getting naked and climbing in bed with some of the male um, uh, guests. And my dad laughed. He goes, well, the guy's complaining. They're like, no, well, let them be. They're just fine.
I was to say,
But
yeah, good.
like, listen, were they having sex? Of course not. Well, it depends how you define sex. Or were they
Right.
having an intimate moment? And for the love of God, I want to be that guy. I want some 95-year-old woman. I'm in my late 90s and a person falling in bed with me. How beautiful and tender is that?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the rates of sexual activity in elderly homes. I heard it's very high, actually. Yes.
Well, think about it. I
No,
mean, but still safe sex, folks. If you're at that age, still safe sex.
I've heard, yeah, the STD, right? The
Right? Is
STI rates
yes,
can be pretty high there. Yes. Yeah, you're looking at
yes.
the end of life. What the hell, Wow, but yes, safe sex.
If you
Um,
want to go out with a bang.
yeah, exactly. Literally, right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I want people to know is you know, we are formed by our relationships. You are not, everyone loves to be special and we are special, but we are formed by our relationships and that being to culture as well. And so, what we find, even with food, interesting or repulsive is a cultural relationship. And it's the same thing in how we relate with other people, right? Monogamy being what is so taught to us, it is going to be uncomfortable to unpack that if you want to, right? Because it has been what so deep, and to really point that arrow towards the systems and acknowledge that those systems are internalized, right? We talk about internalized isms, right? Internalized racism, internalized homophobia, internalized ageism, all that is inside. It's not a reflection of you, but rather the reality that you are created by your culture, right? And so it's going to be uncomfortable to unpack all of this. But, when I record with Dr. Elizabeth Sheff, who does a lot of expert witness testimony for kink and BDSM cases, and also as a sociologist, she's telling me research of 70 to 80% of people are interested in BDSM fantasies. Okay, that's a high number, right? That's why 50 Shades of Grey took off, because it tapped into that for folks. And so I think, your platform is tapping into that again for folks. And we need a space to be able to talk about these things and bring them into the light so that we can change it for future generations. I do have so much hope for your children, for the future children, that they're going to live in a much more expansive world where maybe, like you're saying, your website isn't going to be as relevant as it will transform, right? Like you're doing to have the open platforms, but the infidelity piece of it is going to transform into much more open relationships. And so I do see that future happening every single time that we have this conversation. I mean, I talk about Margaret Sanger, who was arrested in the 1920s for talking about contraception. I talk about
Right.
contraception on this podcast. I talk about fucking multiple people on this podcast, right? Like, and I'm not going to jail. I might get some looks in the field of clinical psychology, which, like, hey, I'll take one for the team on that one. But, you know what I mean? I'm not going to jail. And so I have a lot of hope for all of these conversations, for the work that you're doing, and for the ways that that is changing our cultural consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a world where sometimes we force people into really hard decisions. And I'll give you another example from another member, and I tell these stories. in part because it gives you insight to beyond the data. Data is great to give you a macro, but in the micro, my hope is you can get empathy towards
Oh,
why
yeah.
some people choose infidelities or why people choose Ashley Madison. So we had a member at the time, I think she was in her late 50s, and she was a lawyer. She was well regarded within her legal community, within her actual community. She was, active and a pillar and all that good stuff. But she had married a man who was a couple of years older than herself, and sadly, he fell into early onset Alzheimer's, and she had become his, in essence, caregiver. She
Yeah.
loved this man dearly, and she had zero interest, and there was no chance she was leaving him. But she was obviously very unfulfilled. But because of the traditional job she had and culture she existed within, you know, dating was not viable. She wasn't going to sign up at Tinder or a Match. Like she couldn't do that because she was a married woman.
Right.
And so she chose Ashley Madison and she found a lover through there and was able to have all her intimate needs met. And it allowed her to, you know, wipe away a lot of the stress of being a caregiver for her husband and fulfill all his needs and do that role because she did desperately want to. She didn't want to abandon him. That wasn't her desire. But when you have that frustration, anyone's had to deal with someone in that scenario, it's incredibly hard because your love for somebody exists because the person is right in front of you, but the person doesn't exist because their mind is gone. And so you add that to a lack of intimate connection. And my God, like it's such a sad outcome. And yet she was so happy for what she found. But she would talk about the conflicted feelings she had about it, and that in part in understanding that society put that upon her. And so she worked really hard to try to move that away as best as possible, but it's really difficult. And so, I'd ask your listeners who, are judging me right now saying, Paul, you're an asshole because you work at Ashley Madison, you run this service. What do we ask of these people? Do we just say, oh, they turn to your God and find, happiness in their faith? Well, listen, good for you if you have faith, but intimate needs are physical. They're part of the real world. We've been given these desires, however they've come about, and to repress them and to ignore them always leads to bad health outcomes, whether it's mental, if not physical.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a majority of my listeners would be people who are saying, why don't they just talk about it? Why don't they just talk about it? Because we talk, because the majority of my listeners are relationship anarchists, therapists, people who practice poly, right? And so I think the majority
Yeah,
of my folks would be like, why can't they just talk about it? And I hear you, dear listener. And I often know that a lot of people in their journey into polyamory also start in a place of infidelity.
absolutely. Because, our interests are piqued and maybe it is that can over affair. But like I said, a lot of our members will say they did have the conversation with their partner. They did
Yeah,
talk about the
and
issue
tried.
and their partner is either unwilling or unable. Um,
Yeah.
and one of the interesting parts, I think we did some work years ago looking at when is it most likely to occur in a relationship? And the first bump effect is when it is most likely to happen the first time. First bump effect being when the first pregnancy appears, because prior to that, it's a twosome in a relationship, and you can attend to each other's needs, wants, and desires on a very regular basis. But once that baby shows up, what's interesting about it is what's actually happening there, and it can happen in a multitude of ways. Sometimes a man will say, "Well, you're a mother now. I can't do those things with you any longer because that is inappropriate for a mother to do those things." What a
Madonna and the
ridiculous
whore.
statement.
Yeah.
Madonna and the whore, exactly.
Ugh.
But sometimes a woman will have that same feeling. I can't do that anymore because I'm a mother. And the husband's left going, no, no, you're still my wife. Like you get to play multiple roles. I go to work and I don't do these things at work because I'm, workman Paul. And but at home I
Mm-hmm.
want to do these things. I want to be intimate. And we struggle with it. And that first bump effect is a big driver of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
people will talk about it, but our culture dictates. And if listen, if you marry somebody who comes from a very stringent, you know, religious background, even if they've moved a little bit more open-ish or a little less strict, they still have this foundation that tells them anything outside the norm, whatever they consider norm, is evil,
Mm.
impure, and it's going to lead to incredibly bad outcomes. And good people don't do those things.
Right.
And so, you're going to get shut down by a lot of these people out of their own fears of inadequacy and how they've been raised. And so to your listeners, I understand and I do hear you, but trust me when I tell you, if we were to shut down our business today, not one affair would end. They would
Mm-hmm.
just happen in places where they shouldn't happen, more likely the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think I'm thinking about my positionality right now of working in community mental health and just the amount of clients I have that, you know, there's a lot of privilege to your average podcast listener. I get it's free. I get it's free and you can tune in, but there's still a lot of privilege in having the time and energy to listen to something like this. And there are so many clients I work with who don't have any of this access. And so, like you're saying, divorce is not even an option. And particularly in our society, a lot of women are dependent on that marriage and they could not possibly leave. And so having that conversation about opening it up or any of it, could ruin the relationship and then therefore lose their ability to survive. I mean, there's just so many factors here. And so I think maybe we don't cast the stone, right? Maybe we just stop trying to blame people for this and just try to create more openness, which is what I hear you doing and trying to create that space in terms of the, cheating to openness for folks and that because you're right, it's still going to happen regardless. And so creating more conversation is powerful.
Yeah, I don't see my job as going out to convince people to have affairs because
Right, right.
I fundamentally believe I cannot convince a happily married couple to have an affair. I don't believe that's within my capacity. No 30-second commercials has the ability to do that as good as it may be. What I do believe that I can do is inform people about what's happening in the world of infidelity versus what you think. What are the motivations? What are the outcomes? So you can make a better judgment. You still may then say, I don't like it. And that's okay, but at least it's coming from a place of understanding and wisdom versus, a mythology that we've been raised either through, our religion or our government or just our family strictures. And the more we have the capacity to understand, the more we can have empathy for those who make this choice for a variety of reasons. And hopefully, as you said, we get to a place where the taboos that prevent us from having these open conversations are removed and Ash and Madison can evolve into happily ever after the next chapter, which is a world where
Hmm.
monogamy is not strictly defined by your religion, but by how you and your partner or partners decide to define your monogamy.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that's where I throw the word sexual fidelity. What if we let go of even the word monogamy to say I practice sexual fidelity, whether that's in my triad polycule or with my one person, right? Like that might even get us past, the cultural connotations to that word to just say, yeah, I practice sexual fidelity, right? And so, yeah, I see that world, I see that vision. And so I appreciate everything that you shared and even the research and the platform and all of the resources that you do have create space to have the research on us, which in our current culture there's not a lot of funding for sex research, right? So like
Nope.
I'm grateful that you are doing that research and taking these the resources that you do have to research these things and then create content for all of us to learn from.
Yeah, and listen, anyone who is, an academic who's looking to study this, they can come to us and we'll look at your proposal. I have another study that was just put on my desk a week ago, and it is looking at, well, I'm not going to say that because I don't want to
Sure, yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
undermine her research.
Intellectual
That's not fair to
property.
her. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's her intellectual property. But she's studying a different dynamic of infidelity and some of the causes that lead to it. So she's less looking at outcomes and motivations, but what are the causes? And I think there's a specific area she's going to look at. And I think it's going to be fascinating as it pertains to giving people, again, more insight around. The more we know about things, the better equipped we are to deal with things. And I think the more we come to understand not just infidelity, but monogamy just as a construct. What does it really mean? We just assume a whole bunch of shit when we
Oh
jump into
yeah.
these relationships. And it's fascinating how many people get in trouble because they assume stuff and they don't really talk about it. So listen,
Mhm.
listeners, and again, the majority of your listeners have already gone down the rabbit hole and they're
Yeah.
out there, whether
Yeah.
they're poly or not, but it just, they're expressive in their intimacy and open with their partner or partners. My God, that's you're in a wonderful place. But don't judge those who haven't quite got there. Seek to be a helping hand and find out the information that leads to these causes. Empower them to have the conversations with their partners or themselves, more importantly, about what is a fulfilling life, what is a fulfilling intimate partnership look like? Where do are my needs being met and where are they not being met? And how do I get there?
Yeah.
And those are really difficult conversations for people to answer
Yes.
for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And again, don't cast the stone, because we just have to talk about, like you're saying, those skills, right? In America, I looked up this data recently, but I believe it was around 40% of people have a undergraduate degree, right? So the majority of Americans don't, right? The average reading level in America is sixth grade. I have a doctorate. I am of the 1%. So when I say, "Oh yeah, I have all these conversations," like I am not realizing, or
You're on the
I
far right of the bell curve.
yes, I have to realize every day that things to me that seem easy are I am the 1% of the educated. And I know I have a lot of therapists who listen to this podcast, right? So all of you therapists are also part of, the 1% or wherever you're at in terms of education and that one, right? So it's like, I think people need to understand that this is a structural problem. When we have issues with communication, it is part of a larger structural problem that is not prioritizing emotional insight and relational skills as part of our education. And so I just want people to chill out and see more of the structural pieces that are here before we start getting angry at one another with this, because it's a reality that these systems are a huge part of why we do not have the skills for the conversations yet.
But I will tell you this though, while from my perspective, sitting north of you guys, I do
Sure.
feel that America is shifting towards a more conservative style culture.
Lord help us.
But yeah, fair enough. But
Scary, scary.
at the same time, there is less judgment on infidelity as a whole. And I'll give you a couple examples. When Kamala Harris was running to be president, her husband, Doug Emhoff, had to reveal that he had an affair with his first wife, with the nanny, I think it was.
Mm,
Not long ago, maybe 10, maybe 20 years ago, that would have been the end of her campaign. Any sort of aspect of infidelity within a presidential campaign was the end of that campaign. No way you can continue on. But it was like a day's news cycle. It was in, it was out, it moved on. People didn't judge
right.
it. Now, the individual who did win your election, obviously he denies. He denies. And so, listen, we're not in the business of outing people, so that's not what I'm saying. But regardless of whether he did or did not, the point is, it was in the news cycle consistently, but it didn't stop him. And that is a massive shift. Those of us of a certain age will remember Gary Hart. He was a presidential candidate in, I think, the early 80s. And I think it was 84. And he dared the media to prove he was having an affair because he guaranteed he wasn't having an affair. It took him 24 hours. And he was sleeping with somebody. There was a picture of him on his sailboat with her. And his presidential campaign was sunk the very next day. He
Mm,
dropped. But that's a very short period of time for a shift like that to happen,
yeah.
where people in a leadership position are not being judged on their sexual activities. And
Hmm.
I think so. There is a dichotomy happening in America. So you are seeing an increase in non-monogamy. You are seeing an increase in sexual variety. You're seeing an increase in acceptance to LGBTQ, but at the same time, we see, other aspects that are moving more conservative. You know, abortion laws are being struck down. So where is American society going? It's unknown right now. So the next 4 years are going to be a hell of a roller coaster ride
Yeah,
for you
check
guys.
in. Check in with us. We're not
So long as we
okay.
don't get a next, I do advocate, you always move to Canada.
Thank you.
I think we welcome. I think we were the third country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage way back in the
Um,
90s.
yeah.
So we're like your European northern neighbor, just a little chilly up here.
Hmm.
But if you're from Chicago, you'll survive, I promise.
Totally, totally. It just screams the Handmaid's Tale where they're trying to cross into Canada for, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, Paul, it's clear that I could talk to you for hours on this content. Surely, surely. So I'll be intentional and check in with you and take a deep breath as we're closing together. And then I just want to see if there's anything else that you want to share with the listeners. Otherwise, I have a closing question that I can guide us towards.
Well, I will first want to say thank you so much
Mm,
for a very enlightening conversation. I love when we
yeah.
have people who have the capacity to listen before judgment.
Mm,
I was not here to convince you or your listeners of the value of Ashley Madison, but more to give you insight around, the rationales and what's happening in the world so we can make a better world in the future. And so thank you very much. I appreciate the
yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, it's been such a joy, such a joy. Well, then the closing question that I have for you, Paul, is what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Mm.
I mean, so many things, right? But the
Ah,
one thing.
one thing. Well, I'll tell you, there is an interesting sex trend that is popping up now that we're seeing more in pop culture. And it's something that I think is going to be a big shift that's going to become more popular, probably the younger generation, is pegging.
Sure.
More
Yeah,
and more.
totally.
And now it's interesting. I bring that up for a reason, not because it has any particular relation to me, but more because it's lessening the toxic masculinity that is, I think, the impediment to so many relationships in an issue within just general Western culture as a whole.
hmm
And the more people can embrace, different sexualities and sexual activities that don't necessarily pertain to your sexuality, to your
Yeah.
sexual identity, but just to your pure enjoyment, the better we are. We will watch pornography with women doing just about everything, and then she's still a woman, even though there might be five women in that scene and one guy. All those are women. But a man does anything that is outside of the traditional norm, we judge him.
Yeah.
At least for my generation. And the more we have the capacity to see people for who they are and not identify them by their acts, the better we are
hmm
as people. So
Yeah.
that's the one thing I wish people knew, that what you do in the bedroom does not necessarily dictate any one particular title, and nor
Mm-mm.
should it.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope people can be able to be pegged and feel the same person tomorrow, right? It doesn't have to change everything. I recorded with Cooper Beckel, I believe, is the person that I recorded with many years ago and who wrote a book specifically on pegging and talked about what it meant. And he specifically named that being a struggle of like, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? Right? And it's like, whoa. You enjoy pleasure, right? There's so much pleasure to be had, right? And so I think prostate orgasms, right? Hours. Wow. He really spoke to that. And so I hope people, yeah, I know, right? But I hope people can release and God, my God, just release in your body, explore your body. There's so much good possible pleasure when we can let go of these scripts. And so I know that that world is coming for future generations with every conversation that we have. When you bring that up as what is to be normalized and people get uncomfortable, I love it. Like, open your hearts, folks. Keep opening. Yeah. Well, it's been such a joy to have you on the show, Paul. Thank you for joining.
All my pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.